I still remember that trip like it happened yesterday, even though it's been years. It was the fall of 2012, and I had just turned 32. I had taken a week off work to clear my head after a rough few months, and I decided to go up north into the woods outside of Marquette, Michigan. A friend of mine had an old hunting cabin he rarely used, and he told me I could have it for as long as I needed. It wasn't anything fancy, just 4 walls, a roof, a wood stove, and a pump for water out back. But that was exactly what I wanted. I didn't go alone. I brought my dog, Scout, a big brown mutt with German Shepherd in him. He was 7 then, already slowing down some, but he was still sharp. He had a way of noticing things long before I did. I felt safer with him by my side, especially being that far from anyone. The nearest neighbor was about 2 miles down a dirt track, and the only road into the woods wasn't well traveled except during hunting season. The drive up took me nearly 8 hours. By the time I parked near the cabin, it was late afternoon and the air had that heavy chill that comes before a hard frost. The trees had turned, their leaves scattered across the ground in thick layers that muffled my footsteps as I hauled my bags inside. The cabin smelled like old pine and dust. There was a pile of split logs stacked against the wall, and I wasted no time in getting a fire going in the stove. Scout trotted around sniffing every corner, his nails clicking against the wooden floor. That first night was quiet. I sat at the small table by the window, reading by lantern light, listening to the occasional crack from the stove. Scout curled up near the door, occasionally raising his head to glance outside. When I finally lay down on the old cot in the corner, I slept harder than I had in months. The second day was when things began to feel different. I woke early, made coffee on a little camp stove I had brought, and decided to take Scout for a long walk. We went down along a faint trail that followed a creek. The air was still and damp, with a kind of weight to it that made every sound travel farther than it should have. I noticed Scout kept pausing, ears stiff, staring into the trees. I didn't see anything, but I trusted his instincts. Around noon, we turned back. That's when I saw it, boot prints in the mud near the cabin. Not mine, not fresh, but recent enough, pressed deep into the damp earth. They led around to the back of the cabin and disappeared into the woods. I froze there for a moment, my heart thudding in my chest. Scout barked once, low and sharp, and that sound broke me out of it. I told myself it was probably a hunter passing through, maybe checking the area. But the cabin wasn't marked, and there weren't any signs of hunting blinds nearby. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been around. I double-checked the door, even wedged a chair under the handle. Scout lay by the door again, and I noticed how his breathing never really settled into a steady rhythm like it usually did when he slept. He was alert even in rest. Sometime after midnight, I woke up to a sound. It was faint, like the crunch of leaves under a footstep. At first I thought I was dreaming, but then Scout lifted his head, ears pointed straight up. The fire in the stove had died down to a dim glow, so the room was dark except for that dull orange light. I held my breath and listened. Another crunch, closer this time. My throat went dry. I sat up slowly, reaching for the flashlight I kept by the cot. Scout was already at the door, growling low in his throat, his hackles raised. The sound outside stopped as if whoever or whatever had been moving knew they had been heard. I waited for what felt like forever, every muscle in my body tense, the flashlight heavy in my hand. Nothing else came. Eventually, Scout lay back down, but I barely slept after that. The morning brought no comfort. I went outside, scanning the ground around the cabin. Sure enough, there were prints again, clearer this time, fresher. A man's boots, size 10 or 11 by the look of them. They circled the cabin once and then led off into the trees. The skin on my arms prickled. Someone had been out there watching. I told myself I'd cut my trip short, maybe leave the next day. But as the day went on, I started to think maybe I was overreacting. I carried wood inside, cooked some beans on the stove, and tried to relax. The woods were quiet, maybe too quiet. No virtson, no rustling. Just silence. Scout barely left my side. That night was worse. I didn't even bother trying to sleep right away. I sat at the table, lantern burning low, my eyes fixed on the window. Around 1 in the morning, Scout went rigid. His ears twitched, his head turning toward the back wall of the cabin. Then I heard it, 2 slow, deliberate footsteps in the leaves. Not an animal, a man. My chest tightened so much I thought I'd choke. The steps came closer, right up to the wall, and stopped. Then silence. I gripped the handle of my hunting knife so tight my hand cramped. I didn't dare turn the lantern higher, didn't dare make a sound. For nearly an hour, whoever it was stayed out there. I could hear them shifting occasionally, like they were leaning against the wall, waiting. Scout stayed at the door, stiff as a board, growling under his breath. Finally, just before dawn, the sound faded. I sat there until the sun came up, shaking, my eyes burning from exhaustion. When I stepped outside, I saw more prints in the damp earth, circling again, stopping right under the window. That was it for me. I packed up as fast as I could, stuffing clothes into my bag, throwing gear into the truck bed. Scout jumped in without hesitation, still glancing toward the trees. The whole time, I felt eyes on me, like whoever had been out there was watching from the tree line, hidden in the brush. The drive out was brutal. The dirt road was narrow, winding, and covered in fallen leaves. Every shadow between the trees looked like a man waiting to step out in front of me. I didn't stop until I hit the highway, and even then I didn't feel safe. I kept checking the rearview mirror, expecting to see a truck following me. When I got home, I called my friend and told him what had happened. He wasn't surprised. He said there had been reports of squatters up that way, people who stayed deep in the woods, living off whatever they could steal. Some of them didn't take kindly to strangers. He told me I did the right thing leaving. Even now, years later, I still think about those nights. I can still hear the sound of those footsteps in the leaves, steady and patient, circling the cabin in the dark. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't brought Scout with me. Maybe the dog was the only thing that kept whoever it was from trying the door. Maybe they were waiting for me to fall asleep, waiting for the lantern to burn out. All I know is this: I'll never go back to that cabin. Not alone, not with anyone. The woods can feel endless and empty, but sometimes they aren't empty at all. Sometimes someone is out there watching, waiting, and once you've felt that kind of presence, you never really forget it. I had been driving for hours before the dirt road finally opened into a clearing. The countryside stretched wide around me, the kind of quiet place where the sky felt too big and the trees pressed close together, almost like they were leaning in. I was 32 then, restless, and I had rented the old cabin for a week just to get away from the noise of town. It was in southern Kentucky, tucked behind a long stretch of farmland, and the owner told me it hadn't been lived in full-time since the late 80s. That was part of the appeal. The cabin wasn't much when I pulled up. Dark wood siding, roof sagging slightly, weeds thick around the porch. It stood alone at the edge of a tree line, with the nearest neighbor almost 3 miles down the road. The field beside it had once been farmland, but was now nothing but knee-high grass that moved with the wind. I remember stepping out of my truck, the air heavy with the smell of earth and old wood, and hearing only the steady hum of insects. No cars, no voices, just a deep, empty quiet that settled into my chest. Inside, the cabin smelled of dust and stale wood smoke. A single bedroom sat to the right, a narrow kitchen to the left, and a living room with an old stone fireplace straight ahead. The furniture was mismatched, worn, probably left by whoever had lived here last. The floorboards creaked under every step, and I could see tiny cracks in the walls where the light slipped through. I didn't mind. I had brought food, water, and enough supplies to last. I set everything down, opened a window to let some air in, and tried to shake off the strange weight of the place. The first day passed easily enough. I walked the woods behind the cabin, followed deer tracks until they disappeared into mud, and came back scratched up but satisfied. I cooked a small dinner on the old propane stove, then sat out on the porch as the sun went down. The countryside darkened fast. Once the light left the fields, it felt like the whole world pressed in. Crickets screamed from the grass, and far away I thought I heard the faint rumble of something. Maybe a tractor, maybe thunder. That night was when the unease started. I had been lying on the thin mattress for about an hour, staring at the ceiling, when I heard the crunch of footsteps in the grass outside. Not animals, not the quick rustle of deer or raccoons. These were steady, heavy, slow. I froze and listened. The steps circled the cabin once, then stopped near the back. I waited, holding my breath, every hair on my body standing up. After a few minutes, there was nothing, just silence. I told myself it was probably nothing more than the wood shifting or maybe my nerves playing tricks. Eventually, I drifted into a shallow sleep, though I woke often, listening for the sound again. The next morning, I found the grass bent low behind the cabin, trampled into a narrow path that hadn't been there before. The prints were wide, almost like boots, pressed deep into the dirt. I stared at them longer than I should have, then forced myself to walk back inside. I didn't want to admit to myself how much it rattled me. That day, I stayed closer to the cabin. I chopped some wood with the dull axe I found on the porch and tried to keep busy. The countryside was too quiet now. Every sound seemed louder than it should have been. The caw of a crow overhead made me flinch. Even the creaking of the trees sounded like something sneaking up behind me. By the time the sun went down, I was already locking the door and checking the windows twice. The second night was worse. I lay awake, waiting. Around midnight, I heard it again. The same crunch of grass, the same slow circling. My throat tightened as the steps paused at the side window. The window where I had opened the curtain earlier in the day. I could almost feel eyes on me, peering through the thin glass. I stayed frozen, clutching the blanket, praying whoever or whatever it was would move on. After what felt like hours, the sound faded toward the field. I never saw anyone. The next morning, I told myself I had to leave, but the truck wouldn't start. I turned the key over and over, the engine coughing but never catching. I checked under the hood even though I knew nothing about engines. I only knew it had been running fine yesterday. The thought hit me hard. What if someone had tampered with it? Out here, with no cell service and no neighbors nearby, I was stuck until I could figure something out. That day dragged. I barely ate. I couldn't focus on anything except the dread that night would bring. The prints were deeper in the dirt now, clearer, like whoever was walking had come closer to the porch. I stacked wood near the door, not even sure what I planned to do with it. The silence pressed in heavier than before, and I started catching myself looking over my shoulder constantly. By the time night fell, I had pushed a chair against the door and set the axe beside the bed. I barely blinked, staring at the shadows. The steps came again later this time, one slow crunch after another, circling the cabin. My chest pounded so hard I thought it would give me away. Then came a new sound, the faint scrape of metal against the doorknob. Someone was trying it, testing it. I gripped the axe so tight my hands went numb. After a long, endless moment, the sound stopped. Then silence. I didn't sleep at all. When the light finally broke through the thin curtains, I felt like I had survived something, but I knew it wasn't over. I forced myself outside, every nerve screaming. That was when I saw it. On the porch, just inches from the door, lay a crushed cigarette butt, fresh, still smelling faintly of smoke. Whoever had been out there hadn't just circled the cabin. They had stood at the door, close enough to touch it. I knew then I had to get out. I packed my bag fast, hardly thinking, and started walking down the dirt road. The whole time, I kept glancing behind me, half expecting to see someone step out from the trees. The walk felt endless. My legs shook, my throat dry, but I didn't stop until I saw the faint outline of a mailbox in the distance. That meant a house, a neighbor, anyone. By the time I reached the farmhouse, I was drained, shaking from head to toe. An older man came out to the porch, but I didn't explain much. I just asked for help with my truck. He drove me back later that day, and by some miracle, when he tried the key, the truck started right up. He gave me a look, like maybe I was losing my mind, but I didn't care. I loaded my things and drove off without looking back. I never went back to that cabin. I never asked the owner about it either. I didn't want to know who had been walking the fields at night, who had stood at my door with a cigarette, or why the truck hadn't started until someone else was there. Some things you don't need answers for. You just need distance. Even now, years later, when I drive past empty farmland or see an old cabin leaning at the edge of the woods, I feel that same cold knot in my stomach. I remember the sound of slow, steady footsteps pressing into the grass. I remember the cigarette on the porch. And I know for certain, out there in the quiet countryside, someone had been watching me. I still remember the autumn of 1996, when I stayed alone at my uncle's old farm cabin in northern Missouri. I was 28 then, still young enough to think I could handle anything, but not old enough to know better. My uncle had been ill and needed someone to watch over the place while he was in the hospital. I had just left a factory job in Kansas City and didn't have much keeping me tied down, so I offered. I thought it would be quiet, simple work, feeding the animals, making sure no one stole tools, and keeping the cabin in decent shape. What I didn't expect was the uneasy feeling that started the moment I set foot there, and how it grew worse with every day I spent alone. The cabin sat on the far side of the farm, about half a mile from the Maine gravel road. The path leading to it was just two ruts carved into the dirt by years of truck tires. I drove down that path in my old Chevy, bouncing over rocks and holes, the trees closing in on both sides. When the cabin came into view, I felt a small wave of relief. It was a square, weathered building made of gray wood, with a sagging tin roof and a porch that leaned slightly to the right. Beyond it, cornfields stretched in every direction, broken only by a patch of woods to the east. Inside, the cabin smelled of old wood, oil lamps, and mice. The furniture was simple. A wooden table, two chairs, a rusted stove, a single bed pushed against the far wall. The windows were streaked with dirt, and the floor creaked no matter where you stepped. It wasn't comfortable, but it was solid, and I told myself I'd get used to it. The first few days were ordinary. I spent the mornings hauling buckets of feed to the chickens and pigs, then checked on the small barn that held a few cows. Most afternoons I chopped wood or tried to keep the porch from collapsing any further. At night, I'd sit on the steps, smoking and listening to the crickets. It was quiet in a way the city never was, but there was something about that silence that never sat right with me. It wasn't peaceful. It was heavy, like the land was holding its breath. One night, around the 5th day, I noticed the animals were restless. The pigs wouldn't eat. The chickens clucked and rustled long after they should have gone still. Even the cows seemed agitated, shifting in their stalls, their eyes wide when I came near with the lantern. I figured maybe a coyote had been prowling, so I walked the fence line with my shotgun. I didn't see anything, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, just beyond the edge of the corn. That night, I barely slept. The cabin walls were thin, and every sound outside seemed amplified. Twigs snapping, leaves rustling. Once I swore I heard slow, deliberate steps in the dirt near the porch. I lay in bed with the shotgun resting across my chest, staring at the ceiling until the first light of morning broke through the dirty window. The next day, I found boot prints in the soft soil near the pig pen. They weren't mine. I wore heavy work boots, and these were narrower, lighter, like someone else had been walking the property. They circled the pen, then trailed off into the cornfield. I followed them for a while, but the rows were thick and the ground turned hard. I couldn't tell where they ended. I tried to brush it off, thinking maybe some farmhand from the neighboring property had wandered over. Still, I carried the shotgun more often after that. Each night grew worse. The noises became more frequent. Sometimes I'd hear what sounded like breathing outside the window, low and steady, as if someone was standing just inches from the glass. Other times, it was scratching along the wooden walls, faint but steady enough to make my skin crawl. I kept lighting the oil lamp, even when I wanted to save fuel, just so I wouldn't have to sit in the dark. One evening, I returned from the barn to find the cabin door slightly open. I knew I'd shut it that morning. Inside, nothing looked disturbed, but the air felt wrong, as if someone had been there only minutes before. I checked under the bed, inside the closet, even the crawl space beneath the floorboards, but found nothing. That night, I pushed the table against the door before trying to sleep. The cornfields became the worst part. During the day, I sometimes caught glimpses of movement in them. A quick flash, stalks bending where nothing should have been. Once, while checking the fence line, I heard what sounded like whispering carried by the wind from deep inside the rows. It was so faint I couldn't make out words, but it was enough to raise every hair on my neck. By the second week, I wasn't myself anymore. I barely slept, my nerves were shot, and I jumped at every creak of the cabin. The animals grew thinner because they wouldn't settle long enough to eat properly. I started finding dead chickens in the morning, their necks broken but no meat taken, as if someone had killed them just for the act. I buried them behind the barn and worked with my hands shaking. Then came the worst night of all. It was late September, the air crisp, the sky overcast. I had just set the lantern on the table when the dogs from the neighboring farm started barking, a frantic, panicked chorus that echoed across the fields. Moments later, the pigs shrieked, high-pitched and desperate. I grabbed the shotgun and rushed to the window, but the yard was empty. Then the scratching began again, this time at the back wall. Slow, deliberate, like claws dragging against wood. My chest tightened. I aimed the shotgun at the door and waited. The scratching stopped, only to start again on the opposite side of the cabin. Whatever it was circling me. For nearly an hour, it went on scratching, then silence, then footsteps just outside the porch. Once, the doorknob rattled, as if someone was testing it. My throat was dry, my hands slick with sweat, but I never lowered the shotgun. I thought about firing through the wall, but I couldn't risk wasting shells. Finally, just before dawn, everything went quiet. Not the natural kind of quiet either. No crickets, no frogs, no wind in the corn. Just dead, heavy silence. When the first light came, I found more footprints in the dirt, circling the cabin again and again, overlapping in places as though someone had spent hours pacing around me while I sat inside, powerless. That morning, I made up my mind. I wasn't going to wait around to see what happened next. I packed what I could into the truck, my duffel bag, the shotgun, a box of shells, and drove out without looking back. My hands shook the entire way to town. Later, when my uncle recovered and went back to the farm, he called me. He asked why I'd left the cabin in such a hurry, why I hadn't told him. I didn't have the words. All I could say was that the place wasn't right. He stayed there after that, and nothing ever seemed to happen to him, at least not that he told me. But I know what I heard, what I saw. Those footprints, the scratching, the broken-necked chickens, they weren't in my head. Someone was out there, watching, waiting. And the worst part is, I'll never know who it was, or why they singled me out during those nights. All I know is that I'll never set foot in that cabin again. Even now, nearly 30 years later, I still wake some nights to the sound of scratching in my dreams, and for a few seconds, I'm back in that dark, creaking cabin, gripping the shotgun and praying the door holds. It was the summer of 2011, and I had just turned 23. I remember it was one of those hot weeks in late July when the air felt heavy, and everything seemed to move slower. I was staying in a small town in northern Maine with a couple of friends, but I had gotten restless. I've always had this habit of wandering off alone, looking for strange or forgotten places. Old buildings, abandoned factories, back roads that didn't lead anywhere. I was drawn to them. That day, I decided to take my car and just drive further out into the countryside. After about an hour on the back roads, I found a dirt path splitting off the main road. It wasn't marked and it looked barely used, but the tracks suggested that maybe a truck or two had gone through there in recent years. I slowed down and thought about it for a second. Then I pulled in. The road was rough, full of potholes and branches scraping the side of my car, but I kept going. Something about places like that always made me curious. The dirt road twisted through thick trees, getting narrower the deeper I went. After about 20 minutes, the trees broke into a small clearing. There, in the middle of the overgrown grass, was a cabin. It looked like it hadn't been lived in for decades. The wood siding had turned dark gray, the roof sagged slightly, and the front porch leaned like it was tired of standing. The windows were dirty and some of them cracked. Weeds had grown right up against the walls, and vines crawled up around the chimney. I parked my car at the edge of the clearing and stepped out. The air felt still there, almost too quiet. Even the birds weren't making much noise. My shoes crunched on the dry grass as I walked closer. The cabin had a faint smell around it, like old wood mixed with dampness. The front door was closed but tilted in its frame, as if one strong push could break it. I reached for the handle and it gave way easily. The hinges squealed as I pushed it open. Inside, the cabin was dim, with only streaks of sunlight cutting through the broken blinds and dusty windows. It was one big open room with a few doors in the back leading to what I guessed were bedrooms or a bathroom. The air inside was heavy with dust, and every step I took made the floor creak under me. The place looked like whoever once lived there had just walked away. There was a table with two chairs in the middle of the room, one of them tipped on its side. A rusted old stove sat against the far wall with an iron pot still sitting on top. Shelves on the wall held glass jars with the remnants of something that had long since rotted away. A couch sat against one wall, its cushions torn open, the stuffing spilling out like old yellow snow. I walked further in, brushing my hand along the dusty shelves. On one of them, I found a few old cans of food, labels faded and peeling. There were also some tools, an old hammer, a rusted hunting knife, and a couple of empty shotgun shells. The more I looked around, the stranger it felt. This wasn't just abandoned, it was left in a hurry. I decided to check the back rooms. The first door led to what looked like a bedroom. The bed was still made, though the blanket was moth-eaten and full of holes. On the nightstand sat a broken lantern and a small photo frame. I wiped away the dust and saw a black and white photo of a man and a woman, probably from the 1960s. The glass in the frame was cracked, and the faces were faded, but the way they stood together made me think they had lived here once. The next room was smaller, maybe for storage. Shelves lined the walls, holding old mason jars and boxes filled with papers that had gone damp and stuck together. The smell in there was worse, mustier, like mold had been growing quietly for years. I didn't stay long. The last door was at the end of the hallway. When I opened it, the smell hit me first. It was sharp, sour, like something had rotted for a long time. The room was darker than the others, and it took a moment for my eyes to adjust. When they did, I saw a pile in the corner. Old clothes, blankets, and something else I couldn't make out at first. I stepped closer, my chest tight. That's when I realized what I was looking at. It wasn't just a pile of rags. Beneath them was a shape, a human shape. The bones were yellowed, the skull tilted to one side. Whoever it was had been lying there for decades, left to rot in the corner of that room. The clothes were tattered but still clung to the skeleton in places. I froze. My stomach turned. I could feel my heartbeat in my throat. I stood there longer than I should have, staring, trying to take in the reality of it. There was no mistaking it. This was a body. The air in the room felt heavy, like it was pressing down on me. I backed away, my foot hitting an old bucket that clattered against the floor. The sound echoed through the cabin, breaking the silence, and for the first time, I wanted to get out. I turned and hurried down the hallway, nearly tripping on the warped boards. Outside, the air felt cleaner, but the clearing didn't feel any safer. My car sat at the edge, and for a moment, I felt exposed, like the woods themselves were watching me. I climbed into the car, started the engine, and backed out of there as quickly as I could. The trees seemed to close in tighter as I made my way back to the main road. On the drive back to town, I couldn't stop thinking about the skeleton. Who it was, how it had ended up there, why nobody had found it after all these years. That cabin wasn't just forgotten, it was hidden, tucked so far off the road that unless you were looking for it, you'd never know it was there. When I finally got back to town, I went straight to the sheriff's office. I told them exactly what I had seen, gave them directions as best as I could. They didn't seem surprised, more annoyed that another old cabin had turned up with something ugly inside. Later that week, I heard they sent deputies out there. The body was real, just as I'd said. They collected it, but no one seemed to know who it was. The story stuck with me, though. I couldn't get the image out of my head. That dark room, the smell, the way the bones were curled in the corner like the person had just laid down and never gotten up again. For months afterward, I found myself waking up at night, thinking about that cabin, the way it had stood out there in the clearing, silent, waiting, holding on to its secret for decades. Even now, years later, I can still see it when I close my eyes. That gray wood, the sagging roof, the silence pressing down. I've explored a lot of abandoned places in my life, but I never went back to that one. Some places aren't meant to be revisited. Some places are better left to rot away in the woods, carrying their secrets with them until they collapse into the dirt. I was 31 when I decided to spend a week alone in a small cabin deep in the forests of northern Arizona. It was October of 2014, and the air had that cold bite to it, the kind that reminds you winter isn't far off. I rented the cabin from a man in Flagstaff who barely asked me any questions. Just handed me the keys, told me the road would be rough after the first 5 miles, and warned me to watch for elk on the way in. The cabin was smaller than I expected, sitting about 50 yards off a dirt road that looked more like a washed-out trail. It had 1 bedroom, a narrow kitchen, a wood stove, and windows that were dirty enough that I had to rub circles into them just to see outside. There was no electricity, no phone service, and only a propane tank hooked up for cooking. I brought a generator but told myself I'd try to get by without it. I wanted quiet and I wanted space away from people. The first 2 days passed normally. I chopped firewood, walked around the property, and wrote in a notebook I had brought. At night, the silence pressed on me so hard it felt like my ears were ringing. I grew up in Phoenix where there was always the hum of traffic, sirens, or neighbors shouting. Out there, The woods wrapped me in stillness so deep that every small crack of a branch outside sounded like it was happening right in my ear. On the third night, something shifted. I was sitting by the fire in the cabin when I heard movement outside. Heavy but uneven, almost like someone limping. At first, I thought it was an elk or maybe a black bear. I turned off the lantern and waited, trying to listen. The sound moved around the cabin slowly, crunching across the layer of dead leaves. I didn't breathe for what felt like a full minute. Then it stopped, and the night fell back into silence. I told myself it was just wildlife, nothing unusual for the area. But the next morning, when I went outside, I noticed something that made me uneasy. About 30 feet from the cabin, there were prints in the dirt. Too large to be a coyote, too narrow to be a bear. They looked almost like human footprints, but the stride was wrong. One was close together, the next stretched out far, like whoever made them had stumbled or dragged a leg. I crouched down and studied them for a while, but the dirt was dry and crumbly, so I couldn't make out details. That day, I walked farther into the forest to clear my head. The trees out there grew close together, tall ponderosa pines that blocked out the sun. I tried to enjoy the calm, but I kept glancing over my shoulder. Every so often, I thought I saw movement between the trees, like a shadow slipping out of sight just as I turned. I told myself I was paranoid, that being alone too long makes you imagine things. By the time I got back to the cabin, the light was fading fast. I built up the fire and sat close to it, trying to shake the cold that had settled into my bones. Around midnight, I heard it again, that dragging, uneven walk outside. This time it was closer, circling slower than before. My dog, Max, a German shepherd I brought with me, started growling low in his throat. He stood near the door, stiff and alert. That sound he made wasn't like when he barked at strangers back home. This was deep, almost a rumble, like he was afraid but ready to defend. I gripped the rifle I had leaned against the wall. The footsteps circled twice, then stopped right outside the window near the kitchen. I could hear breathing, slow, rough, almost like someone forcing air through their throat. I stayed frozen, rifle across my lap, until the sound moved away into the trees. The next morning, I forced myself outside again. The prints were there, clearer this time, and my stomach dropped when I saw them. They were bare footprints, human but wrong. The toes were longer, spread too wide, and one foot dragged like whoever it was couldn't lift it properly. I followed them a short distance into the trees until they faded into pine needles. That was enough for me. I went back inside and locked the door, though the lock was little more than a flimsy latch. The fifth day, I barely left the cabin. Max stayed restless, pacing back and forth, ears flicking toward the windows. I tried reading, writing, anything to distract myself, but I couldn't focus. As the sun went down, the air got colder, and I dreaded the night coming. Sure enough, around 1 a.m, I woke to Max barking, sharp and frantic. I sat up, heart pounding, and heard something scratching at the wall outside. Not claws, but something scraping wood slowly, dragging across it. I turned off the lantern and crouched low, trying to stay silent. The scratching moved from the wall to the window, then stopped. For a long time, there was nothing. Then, a sound I will never forget. Someone calling my name. It wasn't a normal voice. It was broken, like the syllables were forced out of a throat that wasn't used to making them. Stretched wrong, but still clear enough that I knew it was my name. My blood went cold. I didn't answer. Max barked harder, then whined, then growled again, pacing the door like he was losing his mind. The voice called my name again, slower this time, then silence. I sat against the wall with the rifle until morning light came through the cracks in the window. That morning, I decided I couldn't stay another night. I packed what I could, loaded the truck, and got Max inside. But as I drove down the dirt road, about a quarter-mile from the cabin, I saw movement in the trees to my right. A tall, thin shape keeping pace with the truck. I didn't look at it directly. I couldn't bring myself to, but I caught glimpses of its outline through the trees. It moved too fast for the limp I heard, but its arms swung awkwardly, almost too long for its body. I didn't stop. I kept driving until the dirt road turned to gravel, then to pavement, and finally until I saw other cars on the highway. When I returned the keys to the man in Flagstaff, I didn't say anything. He didn't ask how my stay was, and I didn't volunteer the truth. I drove home, exhausted, and promised myself I'd never go that deep into the woods alone again. Even now, years later, I can still hear that voice calling my name on nights when I can't sleep. I've tried to explain it away. Maybe someone messed with me, maybe my mind twisted sounds in the dark. But the prints, the breathing, the way Max reacted, none of that can be explained by imagination. Something was out there with me, and it wasn't just an animal. I'll never know what it really was, but I know this much. If I had opened that door or answered when it called, I wouldn't be here to tell the story. I remember the summer of 2004 like it was burned into my head. I was 23 years old, broke, and trying to figure out what I was doing with my life. A friend of mine had offered me the use of his uncle's cabin up in northern Michigan, not far from a little town called Ironwood. He said the place was old, tucked into the woods, and mostly used for hunting in the fall, but in the summer it just sat empty. I thought it would be perfect. Cheap, quiet, and far away from the noise I had been dealing with back in the city. The cabin wasn't much, just a squat little building with weathered siding and a tin roof that rattled when the wind came through the trees. It sat at the end of a dirt road that ran off from a two-lane highway. When I pulled up, the grass around the place was knee-high, the kind that makes you think of ticks and snakes. The windows had screens with holes in them, and one of the shutters hung loose, banging every now and then against the siding when the breeze picked up. Inside was about what I expected. A small kitchen with an old stove and fridge that looked like they hadn't been cleaned in years. A living room with a sagging couch, and two bedrooms with thin mattresses on squeaky frames. The smell was a mix of wood, dust, and the faint musk of animals that had probably slipped in over the years. It wasn't comfortable, but I hadn't come up there for comfort. I told myself I wanted peace, but part of me knew I just wanted to get away. The first couple days were fine. I spent most of the daylight hours walking trails, fishing at a nearby lake, and just letting the silence sink in. Nights were different, though. At night, the woods pressed against the cabin in a way that felt heavy. Every sound carried: branches snapping, leaves rustling, owls calling out. I kept the windows shut even though it was warm, because the stillness inside made me feel safer. By the fourth night, I noticed something that stuck with me. Around midnight, when I was lying on the couch half asleep, I heard the crunch of gravel outside. It was faint, but clear, the slow, deliberate sound of footsteps on the driveway. My first thought was that it was an animal, maybe a deer or even a bear. But the steps didn't scatter, didn't rush. They were steady, even, human. I sat up, my ears straining. The sound stopped, then picked up again, moving closer to the cabin. My heart thumped against my ribs, and I reached for the flashlight I kept by my side. I didn't turn it on yet. I just sat there in the dark, gripping it like a weapon, listening. Then nothing. No more footsteps, just silence. I didn't sleep much that night. I told myself it was nothing, maybe a neighbor wandering around, though the closest house was miles down the road. By morning, I had almost convinced myself it was all in my head. The next night it happened again, only this time I was already awake, reading by lantern light. Around the same hour, just past midnight, I heard the gravel crunch again. Slow, steady. This time I turned off the lantern immediately and sat in darkness. The footsteps came up the drive and stopped right outside, near the porch. I could hear breathing, low and heavy, just beyond the thin walls of the cabin. My mouth went dry, and I held the flashlight like I was ready to swing it. After a long stretch of silence, the breathing faded, and the footsteps crunched back down the drive. The next morning, I checked outside. No tracks I could make out, just gravel, dirt, and weeds. But I couldn't shake the image of someone standing out there in the dark, listening, waiting. On the 6th night, I decided to stay awake, to watch and see what was happening. I kept the lantern off and sat in a chair near the window where I had a view of the driveway. Midnight came and went. I almost dozed off when I saw it, the faint movement of a figure at the edge of the trees. My chest tightened. It was definitely a man, standing there watching the cabin. He stayed just far enough back that I couldn't see his face. I sat frozen, every muscle locked. After what felt like forever, he stepped back into the shadows and disappeared. I stayed awake until dawn, staring at the trees, waiting for him to come back. By then, I knew this wasn't my imagination. Someone was coming around the cabin at night, watching, maybe even testing how I would react. My mind went through all the possibilities. A local drunk, some hunter who didn't like strangers around, or worse, someone who had been waiting for a chance to do more than just watch. That day, I packed up some of my things and put them in the car, just in case. I didn't leave, though. I told myself I wasn't going to be run off. I carried a hammer around with me and kept it on the table beside the couch when I slept. The 7th night was the worst. The sound started earlier, before midnight, and this time there was no slow approach. Whoever it was came straight up to the cabin. The porch boards creaked under the weight of footsteps. My throat tightened, and I could feel sweat on my palms. The knob on the front door rattled. Not hard, but just enough to test it. I had locked it earlier, double-checked it in fact, but hearing it shake made my heart slam against my chest. I sat there in the dark, holding the hammer, listening as the knob rattled again, harder this time. Then silence. My own breathing was loud in my ears. A minute later, I heard the crunch of footsteps moving away, fading into the night. That was enough. By sunrise, I had loaded the rest of my stuff into the car. The woods felt different in the daylight, calmer, almost innocent, but I wasn't fooled anymore. I had seen the figure, heard the breathing, the door being tested. Whoever it was, they weren't just passing by. They knew I was there, and they had been coming closer each night. As I pulled out of the driveway, I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone standing at the edge of the trees, watching me leave. But there was nothing, just the cabin shrinking behind me and the dirt road winding back toward town. I never went back to that cabin. My friend asked me later how the trip was, and I just told him it was quiet, peaceful even. I didn't want to explain what had really happened, but the truth is, I'll never forget those nights. The sound of gravel under slow footsteps, the shadow at the tree line, and the creak of the porch boards with someone standing just a few feet from where I sat in the dark. It's been over 20 years since then, but even now, when I hear footsteps outside my house at night, my body tenses up, and I find myself listening the same way I did back then. Waiting, straining, wondering if someone is out there in the dark, watching. I hadn't planned on taking that road again, not after everything that had happened, but sometimes you don't get a choice. It was late October of 2016, just outside of Fairview, Montana, and I was driving alone on the back highway that curved along the river before cutting through the tree line. The weather had shifted fast that day. It had been clear in the morning, a pale sun sitting low in the sky, but by evening a storm had rolled in, heavy gray clouds pressing low and rain beating down in sharp, cold sheets. I was heading home after visiting my sister, tired and restless, just wanting to get back before the storm worsened. The road wasn't one I normally took, but the GPS had rerouted me when construction blocked the main stretch. The minute I realized where I was, my stomach dropped. I knew this road. I hadn't been down it in years, but every turn was burned into my memory. My ex-husband's cabin sat somewhere along it, tucked back behind the trees like a wound you don't want to look at, but still can't forget. The rain smeared across my windshield, the wipers barely keeping up. My headlights cut through the wet darkness, and the trees on both sides bent and shook with the wind. The further I drove, the more a feeling crawled up the back of my neck, that prickling sense of being watched even though I knew I was alone. I hadn't seen another car for miles. When the gravel shoulder widened out, I slowed down, almost against my will. I knew the cabin wasn't far now. I kept telling myself to just keep driving, to not even glance over, but my eyes betrayed me. I recognized the shape of the turnoff instantly. It was narrow, nearly swallowed by weeds, but I knew that path by heart. And there it was, through the curtain of rain, the cabin. The sight of it punched something deep in me. The place looked worse than I remembered, though time had passed. The roof sagged on one side, the windows were black holes in the pale wood siding, and the porch rail had collapsed. The yard was overgrown, weeds climbing high around the old propane tank and rusted-out barrels. A blue tarp flapped weakly along the side, half torn loose. The place looked abandoned, left to rot, but it also looked alive in a way that made my stomach twist, like it was holding something inside. I told myself to keep moving, but instead I pulled over. My tires crunched the wet gravel as the rain hammered down harder. I don't know why I stopped. Maybe it was morbid curiosity, or maybe some part of me needed to see it one last time to close the chapter for good. I sat there for a while with the engine idling, watching the cabin through the blur of rain. The longer I stared, the heavier the air felt. The trees swayed hard in the wind, branches snapping, but the cabin didn't move. It sat still, silent, the way a predator waits. I could remember every night I had spent inside it years ago. The arguments, the way the floor creaked in the hallway, the way he used to go out back to smoke, leaving the door cracked just enough for cold air to leak in. I shut off the engine, and instantly the silence pressed in, broken only by the drumming of rain on the roof. My breath fogged the glass. I don't know what I was expecting, but something about the moment felt wrong. The driveway leading up to the cabin wasn't just overgrown. It looked used. Tire tracks carved into the mud, fresh enough to be darker than the rest. My chest tightened. I knew for a fact he had left that place years ago. He'd moved on, and so had I, in my own way. The cabin was supposed to be empty, forgotten. But those tracks told a different story. I locked the doors without thinking, my finger pressing the button twice just to be sure. I forced myself to look away, to put my hand on the ignition and leave, but then a flicker of movement in one of the windows froze me. It was quick, a flash of pale against the dark, like something or someone had shifted inside. My heart started hammering so hard it hurt. I told myself it was the rain. The water streaming down the glass could have played tricks on my eyes. But deep down I knew what I saw. I knew it wasn't the storm. For the next minute I sat stiff, staring at that window, waiting for it to happen again. The storm made the car rock gently, branches swaying above me. My throat was dry, my hands gripping the wheel so tight my knuckles burned. And then, just as I convinced myself to turn the key, I noticed something else. The curtain on that window was different. When I lived there, the windows never had curtains. He hated them, said they blocked the light. But now there was a curtain hanging there, a faded green fabric swaying ever so slightly, like someone had brushed past it. That was enough. I turned the key, the engine roared to life, and I put the car in gear. As I pulled back onto the road, my headlights swept across the front porch. My stomach dropped again. There were muddy boots sitting there, side by side. Not old ones, Not forgotten relics, but fresh, upright, as though someone had taken them off just hours ago. I drove faster than I should have on that wet, twisting road, my eyes glued forward. The rain was a blur, the trees blending into shadows, but I didn't dare look back. My chest felt like it was caving in, my pulse pounding in my ears. Every bump in the road made me flinch. Every gust of wind sounded like something chasing me. It wasn't until I was miles away, when the cabin was far behind me, that I let myself breathe again. I pulled into a gas station in town, parked under the bright lights, and just sat there with the rain still hammering down. My hands shook on the wheel. I couldn't shake the image of those boots, standing neat on the porch, and the curtain moving in the window. That cabin wasn't abandoned. Someone was living there. Maybe him, maybe someone else. I'll never know for sure. But what I do know is that whoever it was, they didn't want to be seen. And I wasn't supposed to be there. I've never taken that road again. I never even told anyone about that night until now. All I know is that I was lucky. Lucky I didn't get out of the car. Lucky I didn't go closer. Because the way those tracks cut through the mud, the way that curtain swayed, and the way those boots waited by the door, it all told me the same thing. The cabin wasn't empty, and I was never supposed to stop. I rented the cabin in late October of 1997, just outside a small town in northern Maine. I was 32 at the time, working a construction job that kept me under stress, and I thought a week in the woods might clear my head. The cabin was an old hunting place, built in the 50s, and it sat at the end of a dirt road that was barely wide enough for my pickup. By the time I arrived, the sun was already going down, and the air carried that sharp cold that told me winter was close. The cabin wasn't anything special, just a single room with a stove in the corner, a narrow bed, a wooden table, and a screened porch that leaned forward as if the ground beneath it had sunk over time. The paint was peeling off the outside walls, the windows were streaked, and the front steps had soft boards that bent under my weight. Still, I liked the quiet. I liked hearing nothing but wind moving through the pines. I told myself I would spend the week fishing, maybe hiking, and just sitting by the stove with a book. The first night passed without trouble. I built a fire in the stove, unpacked my food and clothes, and ate canned soup while I listened to the woods. It was quiet, only an occasional snap from the fire. I slept heavily, the kind of sleep you only get when you're far from city noise. It was the second night when things changed. I had gone to bed after sitting on the porch for an hour in the dark, watching the trees sway. The sky was clear, a full moon overhead. Around 2 in the morning, I woke up to a sound outside. It wasn't an animal sound I recognized. It wasn't the high bark of a fox or the soft steps of a deer. It was steady, like footsteps in the gravel of the driveway. My truck sat at the edge of that driveway, and I could picture in my mind someone walking slowly around it. I stayed in bed at first, thinking it might be my imagination. But the steps crunched again, closer this time, as if moving toward the cabin. I sat up and held my breath. The fire had burned down, and the room was nearly black, only a faint orange glow in the stove window. I listened hard. The steps stopped, and the silence pressed in so heavy it felt like the walls were holding their breath with me. I didn't move for what felt like minutes. Eventually, I told myself it was probably an animal. A bear maybe sniffing around. But then I remembered bears don't walk that steady, and they don't circle a truck like that. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. At dawn, I stepped outside. The driveway was marked with faint shoe prints. Not boots like mine, but sneakers. Smaller, lighter. They circled the truck, then came right up to the porch steps, where they stopped. No prints going away. No prints leading back to the road. Just ending at my cabin. My stomach dropped when I saw that. I checked the woods, scanning the tree line, but nothing moved out there. I walked down the driveway, checking for more tracks, but the leaves and gravel showed nothing else. Whoever had been there had walked up and stopped. The rest of that day, I tried to act normal. I went fishing at a stream a few miles away. The sun was bright, the air cold, and I even caught a small trout. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been watching me the night before. I kept glancing over my shoulder, scanning the trees, but I didn't see anyone. When I got back to the cabin near dusk, I noticed something small but strange. The truck door on the passenger side was unlocked. I always lock both doors, a habit from living in the city. I stood there staring at the handle, certain I had locked it. I checked inside. Nothing seemed touched, no bags moved, no glove box open. Still, I locked it again, twice, and carried my gear into the cabin. That night, I sat up longer than usual. I didn't want to go to bed. I kept the fire high, and I sat at the table with my flashlight and a book open, though I wasn't reading. Every little creak in the walls made me flinch. Around midnight, the wind picked up, rattling the porch screen, and I thought maybe I was letting paranoia get to me. But then I heard it again. Footsteps outside. Slow, dragging steps. This time they moved along the side of the cabin, brushing against the wall. My heart pounded so hard I felt it in my throat. I turned off the flashlight and sat perfectly still. The fire popped loudly, and for a second I was sure whoever was out there would hear it. The steps paused right outside the window, just a few feet from where I sat. I didn't breathe. I didn't move a muscle. Then silence. Nothing for minutes. I finally forced myself to look through the window, moving just enough to peek out. The moon lit the trees, but no one stood there. My reflection stared back at me from the glass. I stayed up the rest of the night, clutching the fireplace poker in one hand. At dawn, I checked again. More footprints. This time they went around the cabin, stopping at each window. Whoever it was had walked slowly from window to window, as if peering inside. By then I knew I couldn't stay. I packed my things fast, loading the truck with shaking hands. But when I tried the ignition, nothing happened. The engine wouldn't even turn over. I checked under the hood. The battery cables were loose, both of them unscrewed. Someone had been inside the engine during the night. The nearest town was 8 miles away, down a narrow dirt road. I didn't have much choice. I grabbed my backpack, loaded it with food, water, and a flashlight, and started walking. My heart was hammering the whole way. Every time a branch snapped in the woods, I turned, expecting to see someone following. 2 miles down, I saw tire tracks fresh in the dirt, overlapping mine from when I first drove in. The tread was narrow, maybe from an old car. I hadn't seen another cabin or a car the whole week. Someone had been driving up and down the road at night, maybe even parking near my cabin. By the time I reached town, my legs ached and my throat was raw from breathing cold air. I went straight to the sheriff's office. I explained everything, the prints, the steps, the truck battery. He listened quietly, then said the cabin had been empty for years, except for hunters. He told me there had been reports of squatters in the woods, people who lived off cabins when nobody was around. He said some avoided town altogether, moving from place to place. That chilled me worse than anything. Whoever had been outside wasn't some random hiker. It was someone who lived out there, moving in the dark, watching, and waiting for people like me to show up. Someone who knew how to cut a battery cable quietly, how to circle a cabin without being seen. I never went back for the truck. I left it there, let the rental company deal with it. I took a bus back to Boston the next morning and promised myself I would never again stay in a cabin alone. And I haven't. Even now, nearly 30 years later, when I hear gravel crunch under someone's steps at night, my chest tightens. I always lock my doors twice, and I never forget those footprints ending at my cabin porch, with no trail leading away. I had been driving for hours through the narrow roads of rural Kentucky, the kind that twisted through empty valleys and wooded hills where cell service cut out the second you left the highway. It was the fall of 2016, a few weeks after my 34th birthday, and I had rented a small cabin deep in the woods just outside a forgotten little town called Montail. I told myself I needed peace and quiet after a year that had been nothing but stress. Work piling up, a breakup that left me drained, and the noise of the city pressing down on me every night. The listing for the cabin made it look plain, nothing fancy, but it had running water, heat, and just enough space for me to stretch out. By the time I finally pulled into the gravel driveway, it was already late afternoon. The trees stood tall on both sides, their branches bare, rattling softly in the breeze. The air smelled like damp leaves and earth. The cabin itself was small, made of weathered wood that looked older than the power lines that cut across the clearing. A narrow porch stretched along the front, and the windows were dark, almost too dark, as if no light could get inside. My stomach tightened a little as I cut the engine, and for a moment I sat there in silence, staring at the place, telling myself it was fine. Inside, it smelled of wood smoke and dust. The floor creaked as I walked in. There was a small living room with a couch that sagged in the middle, a narrow kitchen with appliances that looked like they hadn't been updated since the early 90s, and a single bedroom with a bed that had a thin quilt folded over it. The bathroom was tiny, but the water ran clear when I tested the tap. Everything seemed fine, if a little worn down. I unpacked slowly, stacking my groceries in the small fridge, laying my bag on the bed, placing my flashlight and pocket knife on the nightstand. I had always been careful about being alone in strange places, especially in the woods. When the sun dipped behind the hills, the silence outside grew heavy. It wasn't the quiet of the city, where there was always a distant hum of traffic or sirens. Out here it was absolute, broken only by the wind moving through the trees and the occasional crack of something shifting in the woods. That first night, I sat on the porch with a mug of coffee, trying to enjoy the stillness. The air was colder than I expected, and I could see my breath in the light of the porch bulb. I noticed how dark the tree-line looked once the sun was gone, almost like a wall of black pressing closer. No stars shone because of the thick clouds, and the moon was hidden. I finished the coffee quickly and went inside. Sometime after midnight, I woke to a sound. At first, I thought it was the wind, but as I lay there, I realized it wasn't. It was footsteps, slow, deliberate, crunching across the gravel outside the cabin. I froze, staring at the ceiling, my chest tightening. There was no mistaking it. Someone was walking around the cabin. I reached for the flashlight on the nightstand and held it tight, though I didn't turn it on. The footsteps moved along the side of the house, then paused. I could hear the faint creak of the porch boards. Whoever it was stopped right outside the window. I stayed as still as I could, hardly breathing. A minute passed, maybe more. Then the sound moved again, this time toward the back of the cabin. I sat there in the dark for hours, gripping the flashlight until my hand hurt. Eventually, the sound faded, and silence returned. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, I went outside to check. The gravel showed faint marks, maybe boot prints, though the rain from the night before had softened them. On the side of the porch, the dirt looked disturbed, as if someone had stood there for a while. I tried to tell myself it could have been an animal, but I knew better. I had lived in the city most of my life, but I wasn't stupid. Boots had been on that gravel. The rest of the day passed in a haze. I tried to distract myself by walking the trails nearby, but every sound made me tense up. The snap of branches, the rustle of leaves. I cut my walk short and went back to the cabin before sunset. That night, I made sure the doors were locked, the curtains drawn tight. Around 2 in the morning, I woke again. This time, it wasn't footsteps. It was tapping. A slow, steady tapping against the back window of the cabin. My throat went dry. I lay there in the dark, listening. It went on for minutes, not rushed, almost like someone wanted me to know they were there. Finally, it stopped. The next morning, when I went outside, I saw it clear. Smudges on the glass. Fingerprints. That was the moment I stopped pretending I was imagining it. Someone was out there, and they knew I was alone. I thought about leaving right then, but the problem was the long dirt road leading out of the woods. If someone wanted to follow me, I'd be trapped with no signal and no way to call for help. I decided I'd wait until daylight the next morning and then drive straight out. That night, I barely moved from the couch. I kept the lights low, listening for anything. Hours dragged by, my nerves raw. Around midnight, I heard the crunch of gravel again. Slow steps circling the cabin. My heart pounded so hard it felt like it shook the room. I gripped the pocket knife I had left beside me. The steps went to the porch, then stopped. Silence. I waited, staring at the door, sweat running down my back. Then I heard it, a faint sound at the door handle, the soft click of someone testing it. I felt sick. My throat closed. I stayed still, the knife shaking in my hand. After what felt like forever, the sound stopped. The footsteps moved away, fading into the woods. I didn't sleep at all. I sat there until the sky started to lighten, every muscle in my body tight. When the sun finally came up, I grabbed my bag, stuffed everything inside, and carried it to the car without even looking back. My hands shook so badly I fumbled the keys, and when the engine finally started, I slammed the gear into drive and tore down the gravel road. My eyes stayed glued to the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone stepping out of the trees. It wasn't until I hit the highway that I let myself breathe. Later, when I got home, I checked the news and the local reports from Montail, searching for anything. Nothing. No reports of break-ins, no warnings, just silence. But I know what I heard. I know what I saw on the glass. Someone had been out there every night, watching, and the only thing that kept me safe was that they never got inside. That was the last time I ever stayed in a cabin alone. It was the autumn of 1997 when I decided to head out on my own for a while, away from the noise of the city. I was 28 at the time, worn out from long shifts and cheap apartments stacked on top of one another. I had saved enough money to take a short leave, and I wanted a place where I wouldn't hear traffic, sirens, or neighbors through paper-thin walls. I chose the hills outside a small town in northern Pennsylvania, an area where the land rolled into thick woods and narrow gravel roads. I carried some tools in the back of my truck, a tarp, nails, a saw, a hammer, and enough food to last a few days. I had it in my head that I could put together a small cabin for myself, something simple but strong enough to keep me dry. I knew it wouldn't be much, but I wanted the experience of building something with my own hands and sleeping in it, even if only once. By late afternoon, I found a flat patch of ground near the tree line, not far from a shallow creek. The air was heavy, with clouds pressing down like they were ready to burst. I worked quickly, marking the ground and cutting lengths of wood. I drove nails with steady swings, my palms sore but steady. As the hours slipped by, the sky darkened to a shade that warned me I didn't have much time. By dusk, I had the frame standing and part of the walls nailed in. The roof was nothing more than beams laid across, but I pulled the tarp over them and tied it down tight. It wasn't much, but it looked like shelter. Sweat mixed with dirt on my face, and my shirt clung to my skin. My back ached, but I felt satisfied, almost proud, even though the cabin looked more like a shack. Then the rain came. It started slow, just faint drops that tapped against the tarp. Then within minutes it was hammering down so hard that I could barely hear myself think. The ground turned soft, and the creek below swelled, rushing louder and faster. I lit a lantern and set it on the dirt floor. its glow flickering against the rough walls. I sat on my pack, breathing hard, watching the water seep in under the edges of the cabin. I tried to settle, but I couldn't shake a feeling crawling in the back of my mind. The woods outside looked darker than anything I had seen before, the kind of black where the trees disappeared into nothing. The rain drowned out every other sound, so I couldn't tell if there was anything moving out there. The roof sagged slightly as water collected on the tarp, creaking with the weight. Every so often, the tarp shifted with a sharp snap, like it was about to give. I told myself it was fine, that it was just a storm, but sitting there alone with the lantern light stretching shadows across the unfinished walls made me restless. I hadn't thought about how different the woods feel at night compared to the day. In daylight, they look calm, almost peaceful. At night, with rain beating down, they look endless, like anything could be hiding out there, watching. Around midnight, the wind picked up. The trees groaned and bent, their tops thrashing. I could hear branches snapping and thudding against the ground. I pressed my back against the wall of the cabin, hoping it would hold. The nails squealed under pressure, and for a second I thought the whole thing would tear apart. The lantern flickered, the flame shrinking every time the wind pushed through the cracks in the wall. Then I heard it. Through the rain and wind, a sound cut sharp, different, close. It wasn't a branch falling or the creek rushing. It was quick, heavy steps splashing through the mud outside the cabin. My body went stiff. My first thought was an animal, maybe a deer, but the steps didn't sound like hooves. They sounded more like boots hitting wet ground. I held my breath, listening, every muscle in my body tight. The steps stopped just outside. I could hear the water dripping from the tarp, rolling down the walls, and then something brushed against the side of the cabin. Not a light touch either. Something solid pressed against the wall hard enough to make the frame shift. I didn't move. The lantern hissed faintly, the rain drummed, and the weight stayed against the wall for what felt like a full minute before it slid away. The steps started again, slow this time, circling. Mud sucked at them with every move. I reached for the hammer I had left near my pack, my hand closing around the wooden handle. My heart was pounding so loud I thought whoever was out there could hear it. The steps circled halfway around the cabin, then stopped again. Silence followed, broken only by rain. I sat like that for nearly an hour, gripping the hammer, staring at the door I had only half finished. A piece of plywood leaned into the frame with no lock, no hinges. I expected it to shift any second, to be pushed open, but it stayed still. Eventually, the sound of footsteps faded. I waited longer, my legs numb, before I dared to let go of the hammer and stretch. By morning, the rain had thinned to a drizzle, and the woods were pale and gray. My cabin leaned slightly from where the wall had been pushed. Mud splattered across the boards. I stepped outside, my boots sinking deep. The ground was covered in prints. Not animal prints, but boot marks, deep and clear in the mud. Someone had been out there, circling my cabin in the storm. They led back toward the trees, into the thick brush where the ground stayed dark. I followed a few steps before stopping myself. The prints went far, deeper into the woods, and I couldn't see where they ended. I knew I shouldn't follow. My stomach turned cold, realizing how far I was from anyone, how alone I really was out there. I went back to the cabin, gathered my pack, and threw everything into the truck bed. I didn't care about finishing it anymore. I didn't care about proving I could sleep out there. I drove back down the gravel road with my shoulders tight, checking my mirrors every mile. I never went back. I never asked around in town either, because I didn't want to hear what it could have been. All I knew was that on that rainy night, out in the hills, someone was close enough to press their weight against the thin wall I had built, and they stayed long enough to let me know they were there. The cabin still stands, or maybe it doesn't. I'll never know. What I do know is that I'll never forget the feeling of sitting in that half-built room with nothing but a tarp over my head, rain hammering down, and someone circling just beyond the light. That was the night I learned how thin the line is between feeling safe and realizing you're not. I had been driving for hours through the back roads of northern Pennsylvania, the kind of roads that twist through the hills and feel like they could vanish into the woods at any turn. It was late October, the kind of cold where the air burns a little when you breathe in too deep, and the trees had already dropped most of their leaves. The hillsides looked bare and lifeless. I had left the main highway to save some time, but the shortcut was a mistake. The sun went down before I even realized I was completely off track. The road I was on grew narrower until it felt like I was driving down a forgotten path that nobody had used in years. My gas gauge was low. My phone kept losing signal, switching between 1 bar and nothing at all. It was almost completely dark when I saw a clearing up ahead. A small cabin sat at the edge of it, surrounded on 3 sides by tall trees, and on the other side by a graveyard. The old iron fence around the cemetery leaned in different directions, and I could see crooked headstones scattered like broken teeth. I didn't want to stop, but I didn't have a choice. My car was almost empty, and I couldn't risk breaking down in the middle of nowhere. The cabin looked abandoned, but the roof was still intact, and I figured I could at least take shelter there until morning. I pulled the car onto the edge of the clearing, shut off the engine, and sat there for a moment, staring at the graveyard. Even in the dim light, I could see the ground was uneven, some of the graves sunken, others with dirt pushed up like something had shifted beneath. The cabin itself was small, 1 story, made of old wood that had gone gray with time. The windows were filthy, but intact. The door leaned a little on its hinges. I stepped out of the car and the cold hit me immediately. The silence was heavy, only broken by the crunch of leaves under my boots. I tried the cabin door and it gave after 1 hard push. The smell hit me first: damp wood, mold, and something faintly sour, like meat gone bad long ago. The floor creaked as I walked in. The room was nearly empty except for an old wooden table with 1 leg propped up by bricks, and a chair with half the back missing. The walls were bare except for nails where pictures might have once hung. A small stone fireplace sat against the far wall, filled with ashes that looked decades old. I checked each corner, shining my flashlight just to make sure no one was inside. The place was empty. I set my bag down by the table and lit one of the small candles I always carried. The flicker of light made the cabin feel smaller. My phone had no service, so I shut it off to save battery. I thought about trying to sleep in the car instead, but the cabin was warmer and at least gave me shelter from the wind. Through the window, I could still see the graveyard. The headstones seemed even closer from inside. I tried to ignore it and unpacked a couple of granola bars and a bottle of water. The candlelight threw shadows across the room, and I caught myself turning my head every few seconds, convinced something was moving in the corners. After eating, I spread my jacket on the floor and lay down. The wood was uneven beneath me, and every time I shifted, the boards creaked. I closed my eyes, but the silence pressed against me. Out there in the trees, I could swear I heard faint movements. Not animals crashing through branches, but softer footsteps. Slow, dragging footsteps. I told myself it was just my imagination. I forced myself to breathe steady, but then I heard something sharp, a metal clink, like the sound of the iron fence shifting. My eyes shot open. I sat up and listened hard. There it was again, a faint squeak, like metal rubbing against metal. I moved to the window and looked out. The graveyard sat there, quiet, the crooked fence surrounding it. But I noticed one section of the iron gate was standing wider than before, like it had been nudged open. I tried to tell myself the wind had done it, though the air outside was still. I stepped back from the window, my heart thumping. I thought about leaving right then, starting the car and driving until it ran out of gas. but I knew that would only leave me stranded farther from anywhere. I forced myself to lie back down, though I didn't take my eyes off the window for a long time. Sometime later, I must have dozed off, because I woke with a jolt to another sound. This time it was closer. A crunch, like weight shifting on dry leaves right outside the cabin wall. My candle had burned low, the room barely lit. I held my breath, straining to hear. Another crunch, then another. Slow, deliberate steps circling the cabin. The wood floor vibrated faintly beneath me, as though something heavy brushed against the wall outside. I stayed completely still, my chest tight, waiting for it to stop. Finally, the sound faded toward the trees. I sat there in silence for what felt like hours before I dared to move again. I didn't hear anything else, but I didn't sleep either. I sat against the wall, gripping the flashlight, watching the window until the first pale light of dawn filtered through. When it was finally bright enough, I gathered my things quickly and stepped outside. The air was sharp and cold. My car sat where I left it, but the ground around the cabin was disturbed. The leaves were crushed, pushed aside in a clear trail that circled the cabin twice before leading toward the graveyard. I followed the path with my eyes. The trail went straight through the gate and stopped at one of the oldest graves, where the dirt looked freshly disturbed. The soil was darker, looser, like someone had been digging during the night. The headstone above it was cracked, the name almost unreadable. I didn't get any closer. My chest felt tight, my instincts screaming at me to get out. I went straight to the car, turned the key, and to my relief, the engine started. The fuel gauge was barely above empty, but I didn't care. I pressed down on the gas and drove away from that place as fast as the road allowed. I didn't look back at the cabin. I didn't look back at the graveyard. The trail of disturbed earth, the open gate, the sound of footsteps outside the cabin. Those images stayed burned in my mind. By the time I reached a gas station 20 miles away, the sun was fully up and the world felt normal again. Cars passed, people moved about, and everything looked ordinary. But I couldn't shake what I saw. I had no explanation for the freshly turned dirt, the steps circling the cabin, or the feeling that something had stood just outside those thin wooden walls while I sat frozen inside. I never told anyone exactly where I had been that night. I don't even think I could find the road again if I tried. All I know is that the cabin was real, the graveyard was real, and something out there in the dark was moving. Something that made me realize that being alone in the woods isn't the same as being safe. And I'll never stop wondering if whatever was walking outside that night went back into the ground, or if it's still moving, waiting for the next person desperate enough to stop at that cabin by the graveyard. I was 33 years old in the fall of 1997 when I took a seasonal job as a park ranger in northern Montana. The job came with a small cabin at the edge of the forest, about a mile off the main road, tucked away near an old trail that hadn't been used much since the 80s. I wasn't expecting comfort. The cabin was bare bones. One room with a wood stove, a cot, a desk, and shelves stacked with old maps and gear left behind by whoever stayed before me. The first week was quiet. My main duty was to patrol the trails, check on campers, and keep an eye out for fire risks. I walked the woods with my radio, logged notes about fallen trees, broken signs, or litter. The days were long but easy, and I liked the silence. At night, I'd sit on the porch and listen to the sound of wind pushing through the pines. Sometimes a coyote would bark in the distance. It all felt manageable, almost peaceful. The trouble started around the second week. I was writing in the logbook one night when I noticed faint scratching at the back wall of the cabin. At first I thought it was a raccoon or porcupine trying to dig at the wood, but when I stepped outside with my flashlight, nothing was there. The ground was undisturbed. The trees stood still in the cold air. I told myself it was nothing and went back in, but I couldn't shake the sound. It had been slow and steady, like someone dragging a stick along the wall. A couple nights later, I woke up to the sound of crunching leaves outside. It was about 2 in the morning. I laid there, staring at the ceiling, holding my breath. The footsteps weren't fast. They moved slowly around the cabin, pausing every few steps. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I didn't dare move. I didn't have a gun, just a heavy flashlight. After about 5 minutes, the sound stopped. I stayed awake until dawn, listening, waiting. The next morning, I checked around the cabin. The ground was soft from rain, so I expected to see prints, but there weren't any. No boot marks, no paw prints, nothing. That bothered me more than the noise itself. From then on, I started noticing little things. My lantern, which I always left on the shelf by the door, was sitting on the desk one morning. My pack, which I left leaning against the wall, had been moved closer to the stove. I thought maybe I was losing track, maybe just tired, but I knew deep down I hadn't misplaced anything. By the 3rd week, I stopped sleeping through the night. Every noise set me off. I'd wake to the sound of twigs snapping outside, or what I thought was someone brushing against the cabin. I would sit up in bed, gripping the flashlight, staring at the door. My skin itched from nerves, and my body ached from never resting properly. One night, rain came hard, hammering the roof. I was finally starting to drift off when I heard something heavy slam against the porch. Not a branch falling, it was too deliberate. It shook the cabin floor. I sat frozen for a long time before I forced myself to look out the window. The rain blurred everything, but I swear I saw a shape standing near the treeline. It wasn't moving. It just stood there. I didn't sleep at all that night. The next day, I hiked to the ranger station 10 miles away. I told my supervisor about strange noises and possible trespassers. He brushed it off, said I was probably dealing with black bears or maybe a hunter straying too close. He reminded me to log everything but didn't seem concerned. I didn't press it. Part of me wondered if I was just being jumpy, but another part knew better. When I returned to my cabin that evening, I noticed something I hadn't before. The back window, the one I never touched, had faint smudges on the glass. They looked like greasy handprints, not clear enough to be sharp, but enough to make me sick to my stomach. Someone had been that close, watching inside. After that, I started locking the door with the small bolt every night, even though we were told it wasn't necessary out there. I even stacked a chair under the doorknob. It didn't help me feel safer. The sense of being watched only grew worse. The worst night came in early November. The air was sharp and cold, and the forest was dead quiet. I was lying in bed, my lantern still burning because I couldn't stand the dark anymore, when I heard the doorknob rattle. Not just once, but turning, slow and careful, like someone testing it. I froze. My body went cold, every muscle locked up. The bolt held, but the sound kept going, twisting back and forth. I thought about shouting, but fear glued my throat shut. After maybe 30 seconds, the knob stopped. Then I heard slow footsteps circling the cabin, crunching over the frost. They went from the door, past the side window, then around to the back. I could track them in my head, following the sound. I gripped the flashlight and sat there, ready to swing at anything that came through. The footsteps stopped at the back wall, and for a long time there was nothing. Then came the scratching, that same dragging noise I'd heard weeks before, only this time it was harder, rougher, like metal against wood. I didn't sleep. I sat on the cot until morning, staring at the door, waiting for the sun. When daylight finally came, I went outside to check. The back wall had marks on it. Thin, sharp grooves cut into the wood. They weren't deep, but they were deliberate. I found no prints in the frost, no sign of anyone, just those scratches. That was enough for me. I packed my things and hiked back to the station. I told my supervisor I couldn't stay in the cabin anymore. He looked at me like I was weak, but he didn't argue. He reassigned me to day patrols closer to the station for the rest of the season. I never went back to that cabin. Years have passed since then, but I still think about those nights. I've worked other parks, stayed in other cabins, but nothing has ever felt the same. I keep stronger locks on my doors now, and I check the windows more than I should. When I hear noises outside at night, I can't stop my body from tensing up. I don't know who or what was out there in Montana. Maybe it was someone living in the woods, drifting from place to place. Maybe it was just someone messing with me, though I can't imagine why they'd go so far out of their way. I only know that whatever it was, it knew where I slept, it came right up to the walls, and it wanted me to know it was there. That's the part that stays with me, the knowing. I had taken a week off work that September of 2014, the year I turned 33. My life back then had been nothing but a line of long hours at the office and short nights of restless sleep. A friend of mine had suggested I get away from London for a while, so I booked a small wooden cabin in Northumberland, not far from Kielder Forest. The photos online made it look quiet, with a small lake nearby and a trail that ran into the woods. It seemed perfect. The drive from Newcastle train station to the cabin took nearly 2 hours, the narrow country roads twisting and dipping until I felt like I had stepped back 100 years in time. When I finally pulled up, the place looked even more isolated than the pictures had shown. The cabin stood in a clearing of its own, a squat wooden building with a porch and one small shed out back. There were no neighbors in sight, only a stretch of trees on all sides. I remember standing there with my bag in my hand, breathing the cool air and telling myself that this was exactly what I needed. Inside, the cabin was simple. One bedroom with a thin bed, a kitchen with an old gas cooker, a bathroom with a weak shower, and a small living room with a dusty sofa and a wood-burning stove. The windows had thin curtains, and when the wind picked up, the fabric shifted just enough to let in slivers of light. There was no television, and the mobile reception was almost non-existent. I thought that was a blessing at first. The first 2 days passed quietly. I walked along the lakeside, cooked simple meals, and spent my evenings reading by the dim lamp. At night, the silence was heavier than anything I had known in the city. It pressed in from all sides, broken only by the occasional hoot of an owl or the sound of branches cracking in the woods. I kept telling myself those were deer moving about, nothing more. It was the third night when I first saw her. I had been sitting on the porch after dinner, staring out at the dark tree line. The air was cold, and I pulled my jacket tight. That's when I noticed something pale between the trees, far off but clear against the darker bark. At first I thought it was a trick of the moonlight, maybe a birch tree. But then it shifted slightly, just enough to catch my eye. It was a woman. She stood just inside the line of trees, still and thin, wearing what looked like a long gray coat that almost brushed the ground. Her hair was light, maybe blonde or gray, and hung loose around her shoulders. She wasn't moving, wasn't walking, just standing and watching. I sat there frozen, my mind scrambling to make sense of it. There was no one else supposed to be out here, at least not this close. The nearest farmhouse I had passed on the drive was miles back. I didn't stay out there long. I went back inside, locked the door, and tried to convince myself she had been a hiker, maybe someone lost or cutting across the land. But something about the way she hadn't moved, not even a hand or a tilt of her head, made my skin crawl. The next morning, I told myself I'd imagined it. Maybe I had been tired, maybe the shadows had formed into the shape of a figure. I almost laughed at myself for being so jumpy, but that laugh didn't last long. On the fourth night, I woke around 2 in the morning. The cabin was cold and silent. I don't know what woke me, but when I opened my eyes, I had the heavy feeling of being watched. I lay still, staring at the ceiling, before forcing myself to roll over. Through the thin curtain, I could see the pale shape again, closer this time. She was standing at the edge of the clearing, no more than 20 meters from the cabin. Her outline was sharper, clearer, and even in the dark I could make out her face. It wasn't twisted or monstrous, just ordinary, plain, but with no expression at all. Just blank. I stayed frozen for what felt like hours, my chest tight, my ears straining for any sound of movement, but she didn't move. Eventually, I shut my eyes and forced myself to stay still until sleep took me again. The next day, I walked the clearing, checking for footprints, but the ground was firm and dry. There was nothing. That should have calmed me, but instead it left me with a sick sense of doubt. By the fifth night, I couldn't relax. I kept the lamps on, left the curtains closed, and sat awake listening. Around midnight, I heard it, the crunch of footsteps outside on the gravel path that led to the porch. Slow, deliberate steps. My mouth went dry. I turned off the lamp and crouched low, peeking through the corner of the curtain. She was there again, right at the edge of the porch this time, closer than ever. Her head tilted slightly as if she was looking at the door, at me. I couldn't see her eyes clearly, but I felt them fixed on me. My whole body was locked in place. She didn't knock, didn't try the handle, just stood there. After what must have been minutes, though it felt longer, she slowly turned and walked back into the trees until the dark swallowed her. I didn't sleep at all that night. The following morning, I packed my things. I was meant to stay 2 more nights, but I couldn't. Every nerve in my body told me to leave. As I loaded my bag into the car, I looked once more at the tree line. She wasn't there, but the silence felt heavier, like the woods themselves were holding their breath. The drive back to Newcastle was long and tense. I kept checking the mirror, half expecting to see that pale figure at the side of the road. When I finally reached the city, the noise and movement of people felt like a relief I hadn't realized I'd needed. In the weeks after, I kept replaying it in my head. Maybe she had been some local, maybe she lived in the woods, maybe she was lost or unstable. The police wouldn't have done anything even if I had reported it. No crime had happened. But the way she appeared night after night, closer each time, always silent, always watching, it didn't feel random. I never went back to that cabin. I never booked another one either. Even now, years later, I can still see her standing there in the dark, coat brushing the ground, face pale and expressionless, watching without a word. It taught me something I can't unlearn. The worst kind of fear isn't what jumps out at you. It's what stands still, waiting without explanation. And that night in Northumberland, I met that kind of fear face to face. I still remember the cold bite of the air that night, the way it cut into my lungs when I stepped out of the truck and looked at the cabin. It was the fall of 1998, late October, and I had driven out to northern Michigan for a week of deer hunting. I was 35 then, a little worn from work, not the kind of man who liked company, and I had picked this spot because it was quiet, far from the main road. The cabin itself wasn't mine. It belonged to a friend of a friend who said I could use it whenever I wanted. It sat on a patch of land close to the state forest, down a dirt track so narrow you could miss it if you weren't looking hard. The cabin wasn't much. A small wooden structure with a single bedroom, a wood stove, and a porch that leaned forward like it was tired. There was no electricity, no phone line, just an old hand pump out back for water. That suited me fine. I wanted the stillness. I wanted the kind of silence that hums in your ears. The first couple of days passed like they always do on a trip like that. I'd wake before sunrise, heat up some coffee on the little propane stove I'd brought, and then sit in the woods until the sky turned orange. I tracked a few deer, even saw a decent buck once, but I let him go because it felt too soon in the trip. I spent the afternoons cutting firewood, checking my rifle and walking the trails. At night, I sat by the stove with the lantern light flickering off the walls, listening to the wind press against the boards. By the third night, I started to notice things that didn't sit right. Small things at first. When I came back from hunting one evening, the pile of kindling I had stacked neatly beside the porch was scattered, like something had dug through it. I figured it was raccoons. Later, I found boot-shaped impressions in the mud near the pump. They weren't mine, I checked. The tread was different, more worn, as if the boots had been used for years. I told myself maybe they belonged to loggers passing through. That night, I woke up to a sound outside. It was close, maybe only 10 or 15 feet from the cabin wall. At first I thought it was a deer, but it was too slow, too deliberate. Footsteps, crunching through leaves. Then it stopped. I sat in bed with my rifle across my lap, listening to the stove ticking as it cooled. Every nerve in my body wound tight. I must have sat there for 2 hours, waiting. Nothing else came, and eventually I drifted back to a shallow, uneasy sleep. The next morning, frost covered everything in a thin white layer. I walked the perimeter of the cabin, rifle in hand, and found more of the boot prints leading into the trees. They circled the cabin once before heading north. That rattled me. Whoever it was had walked all the way around in the dark while I was inside. I considered packing up and leaving, but stubbornness got the better of me. I told myself I wasn't going to let some trespasser scare me off. I stayed close to the cabin that day, stacking firewood and keeping my ears open. I didn't see or hear anyone. By sundown, I was telling myself it had just been my imagination, or maybe hunters cutting through the land. But when I went inside for the night, I noticed something that made my stomach sink. The latch on the back window, one I was sure I had locked, was open. The window itself was still shut, but the metal hook dangled loose. My chest went tight, and I forced myself to lock it again. I pushed the table against that side of the wall just in case. That night, I barely slept. Every creak of the wood, every gust of wind across the roof sounded like footsteps. Sometime after midnight, I smelled something faint, something that didn't belong inside the cabin. It was a mix of sweat and damp wool, the way an old coat smells after rain. It was there for a few minutes, then gone. The fifth morning, I made up my mind to leave early. My nerves were shot, and I wasn't enjoying the trip anymore. I started packing, but before I could finish, I noticed the boot prints again. This time they came right up to the porch steps. Not just one set, too. One pair was smaller, maybe a size 9, and the other much larger, at least a 12. I stood there staring at them for a long time, my breath clouding in the air, trying to make sense of it. Instead of going back inside, I dragged my gear onto the porch and sat there with the rifle across my knees, watching the tree line. The woods were so still it made my ears ring. Hours passed, and I didn't see anything move, not even a bird. When evening came, I lit the lantern and stayed awake, sitting at the table with my back to the wall. At some point in the night, I heard the crunch of footsteps again. This time, they didn't stop. They came right up to the cabin wall. My heart pounded so hard I felt it in my throat. Then I heard another set of steps join the first. They moved slowly around the cabin, stopping near each window. The sound of breathing low, steady, pressed through the wood. I didn't move. I kept the rifle aimed at the door, my finger trembling on the trigger. Whoever it was never knocked, never tried the handle. They just circled and circled, dragging their boots through the dirt. It went on for what felt like hours. Then, just as sudden as it began, the sound faded back into the trees. When daylight finally came, I stepped outside, exhausted and shaking. The ground around the cabin looked like a storm had hit it. Dozens of boot prints trampled the frost, overlapping, weaving, circling. It was no accident. Someone had been out there, more than one person, and they had been watching me the whole time. I didn't bother packing the rest of my things neatly. I shoved everything into the truck and sped down that dirt road without looking back. My hands gripped the wheel so tight they cramped. I didn't stop until I hit the main highway, where cars passed and the world felt normal again. I never went back to that cabin. I didn't even ask my friend about it. Some places don't want you there, and some people wait for the ones who come alone. I tell myself I left at the right time, because if I had stayed another night, I don't think I'd be here to talk about it.